Most people know Washington, D.C. as power, monuments, marble, a city deliberately designed to project the authority of a new nation. But if you strip away the columns and the grand avenues, if you peel back the layers of construction and intention, you reach something far older and far quieter. A landscape that existed long before any president set foot here, before the surveyors arrived, before the cornerstone was laid, before anyone called this place a capital at all. In this video, I use modern AI tools to animate historic maps, early engravings, and long-forgotten illustrations, shifting perspective, moving the camera, breathing motion into images that have sat still for centuries. The goal is not simply to look at the past, but to move through it, to stand on the banks of the Potomac as it once was, and try to feel what this land might have offered and what it cost. And if you stay until the end, we'll return to these same locations as they appear today, to see what has vanished, what has endured, and what the city we know now still quietly owes to the world that came before it. Long before there was a federal district, there was a river. The Potomac, a name drawn from the Algonquian word meaning something is being brought, or where tribute is brought, was not empty land waiting to be discovered. It was home. For thousands of years, the Nacotchtank people, also called the Anacostans, lived along its eastern bank, exactly where the city's southeastern quadrant stands today. They built longhouses, cultivated crops, and maintained trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. This was not wilderness. It was a managed, inhabited world. Look at this early European rendering of the region, made not from experience, but from second-hand description, pieced together from traders and explorers who passed through before any permanent settlement took root. The river dominates everything, wide, slow, and full of fish. The surrounding land is dense with forest, broken only by fields cleared for planting, and the smoke of villages settled into the hillsides. What strikes you standing here in imagination is the scale of the silence. If you arrived by canoe from the Chesapeake, the land would have risen gently from the water, green and unhurried, with no hint of what would one day be built upon it, just trees and river and the sound of wind moving through both. This map was made by Captain John Smith in 1612, one of the earliest accurate European surveys of the Chesapeake and its river system. Smith himself explored the Potomac by open boat in 1608, making note of the villages along its shores, the depth of its channels, and the richness of its surrounding land. Notice how he marks the Nacotchtank village directly at the confluence of the Anacostia and Potomac rivers, the precise location that would, nearly 2 centuries later, be chosen as the site of the nation's capital. Smith didn't know that, of course. He was taking notes, not writing prophecy. But looking at this map now, with everything that followed in mind, there's something quietly eerie about seeing that mark on the page, a dot on a map that would one day become the center of a country that hadn't yet been imagined. By the mid-1600s, the Nacotchtank were gone from their ancestral land, displaced, reduced by disease, and pushed out by the expanding reach of English settlement. In their place came planters, and what they planted, above all else, was tobacco. The Tidewater region of Virginia and Maryland became one of the most productive tobacco-growing areas in the known world. Large plantations spread along both banks of the Potomac, their docks jutting into the river to receive supply ships and load their harvests directly onto vessels bound for England. The river was not scenery, it was a highway. This illustration shows what a working plantation along the lower Potomac might have looked like in this period. The main house stands back from the water, surrounded by outbuildings, a smokehouse, a cooperage, quarters for the enslaved people who did the actual labor of cultivation and harvest. It is important to sit with that. The wealth of this landscape was built not just from soil and river, but from the forced labor of thousands of men, women, and children who had no say in any of it. Looking at this scene now, it would be easy to see only the pastoral calm, the broad river, the leafy trees, the whitewashed buildings. But that calm was purchased at an enormous cost, and the land beneath Washington, D.C. carries that weight forward, embedded in every acre it stands on. As tobacco wealth concentrated, so did land ownership. This map from the 1670s shows a patchwork of land grants carved across the neck of territory that would later become the district. Large estates claimed the best river frontage, smaller parcels filled in around them, and over these same years, the names began to appear that would echo forward into later history. One of them was a grant called the Widow's Mite. Another was simply called Rome. Whether that second name was meaningful or accidental, no one today can say for certain. But it sits there on the old maps, quiet and strange, on the hill that would one day hold the United States Capitol building. By 1751, a town had been formally established on the Maryland bank of the Potomac at a place the Algonquian had long known as a natural crossing point. The English named it Georgetown, after King George II, though it would outlast that king's dynasty by centuries and eventually be absorbed into a republic that had no interest in kings at all. Georgetown sat at the fall line, the geological boundary where the coastal plain meets the harder rock of the Piedmont, and where the river drops in a series of rapids. Ships could come no farther upstream than this point. That made Georgetown not just a convenient location, but a necessary one. It was the head of navigation on the Potomac, the place where river traffic ended and overland routes began. This early view of the Georgetown waterfront captures something of what arriving here by boat must have felt like. The town climbs the hillside in a loose arrangement of warehouses, taverns, and residences. The docks are busy. Tobacco hogsheads wait to be loaded. Small craft move between the larger vessels anchored in the deeper channel. It's a scene of ordinary commerce. Nothing here suggests that within a few decades, surveyors would arrive with chains and instruments to lay out the boundaries of an entirely new kind of city just downriver. Georgetown had no idea what was coming. It was simply doing what river towns do, getting on with trade. This map from 1775 gives a clearer sense of the regional geography on the eve of revolution. Georgetown appears as already one of the more significant settlements along the upper Potomac. But what the map also shows is how thinly settled much of the surrounding area still was. The land between Georgetown and Alexandria, the exact territory that would soon be designated as the federal district, was largely farmland, marshes, and quiet woodland. It was chosen, in part, for that very reason, a compromise location, roughly equidistant between the northern and southern states, situated on ground that belonged to no single powerful city and could therefore be shaped entirely by intention. The blankness of this landscape was seen as opportunity. The history already written into it was largely invisible to those doing the choosing. Across the river from Georgetown and downriver from the future capital site lay Alexandria, Virginia. By the mid-1700s, already a prosperous and well-organized town with a carefully laid grid of streets and a busy harbor. Alexandria was a merchant city. Its wharves handled tobacco, grain, and flour. Its taverns served as informal trading floors where planters, factors, and sea captains negotiated prices and settled accounts. Its streets were lined with the brick townhouses of successful tradespeople, lawyers, and landowners who had done well from the Potomac trade. One of those landowners was a young Virginian from a family that had already established itself along the river, a man who at this point in history was better known locally as a militia officer and ambitious planter than as anything more. His name was George Washington, and his estate at Mount Vernon sat just a few miles downstream from the town that bore the name he had not yet made famous. He attended church in Alexandria, conducted business in its counting houses, and knew its streets as well as any resident. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the man for whom the capital was eventually named spent much of his early adult life within easy riding distance of the ground it would be built on, without any knowledge that it would carry his name forever. This image shows Carlisle House, built in 1753 by Scottish merchant John Carlisle, one of the most substantial private residences constructed in Alexandria during the colonial period. It was built in the Palladian style, an architectural vocabulary borrowed from Italian Renaissance design that had become fashionable among wealthy Virginians who wanted their buildings to speak the language of refinement and permanence. In 1755, this house hosted a meeting of genuine historical consequence. General Edward Braddock, commander of British forces in North America, gathered the colonial governors here to plan a military campaign against French positions in the Ohio Valley. It was a meeting that went badly. Braddock's expedition ended in disaster that summer, ambushed in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Among the colonial officers who survived that battle was a young George Washington, who rode through the wreckage carrying dispatches and would later write that he had 4 bullet holes in his coat. History had already begun to press its fingerprints into this landscape long before anyone thought to build a capital here. After the Revolution, when the question of where to place a permanent national capital became one of the most contentious debates in the young republic, the Potomac's advocates had a powerful argument beyond geography and political compromise. They had a vision. George Washington, by now the figure his name had always been destined to become, genuinely believed that the Potomac River was the key to binding the new nation together. Beyond the fall line at Georgetown, the river reached deep into the interior of the continent. If its rapids and falls could be bypassed by a series of canals, goods from the western frontier could flow down to Tidewater and out to the Atlantic world. The Potomac would become a commercial spine connecting east to west. In 1785, Washington helped found the Potomac Company, an ambitious engineering venture aimed at exactly this. This map shows the company's survey of the Great Falls, the most dramatic obstacle on the river, where the Potomac drops nearly 75 feet over a short stretch of broken rock. Workers would need to cut a canal around it, blasting and chipping through solid stone. The work was brutal. It moved slowly. The full vision was never quite realized in Washington's lifetime. But the impulse behind it, The belief that this river and this location were not just symbolically significant, but practically essential, shaped every argument made in favor of placing the capital here. In 1791, the survey began. Andrew Ellicott and his assistant Benjamin Banneker, a free black man, mathematician, and self-taught astronomer from Maryland, set out to mark the boundaries of the 10-mile square that would become the District of Columbia. Banneker's role in this work is worth pausing on. He had taught himself astronomy from borrowed books. He computed ephemerides, precise astronomical tables predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets that were published annually and widely read. He later wrote a famous letter to Thomas Jefferson, challenging the contradiction between Jefferson's stated belief in human equality and his continued enslavement of other people. Jefferson's reply was polite but evasive. Banneker stood in a field along the edge of the future capital and measured the stars to determine where the lines should fall. His calculations were precise. The stones he and Ellicott placed still mark the original corners of the district today, sitting quietly in parks and wooded lots, largely unnoticed. There is something deeply fitting about the fact that one of the men who laid out the geometry of this place was someone the laws of that same republic refused to see fully as a person. The plan for the capital came from a French engineer named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who had served in the Continental Army and carried in his mind a vision shaped by Versailles and the broad avenues of Paris. L'Enfant walked this land in person, climbing its hills, following its streams, and reading its topography the way an architect reads a site. What he produced was unlike any city plan in the existing American experience. Grand diagonal avenues cutting across a regular grid, circles and squares at major intersections designed to break long sight lines and create natural focal points. Wide open spaces reserved for monuments not yet imagined, and at the two most prominent elevations, Jenkins Hill and the land to its west, the Capitol Building and the President's House, linked by the longest avenue and separated by a carefully calculated distance that gave each its own gravity while keeping them in visual conversation. This plan was ambitious to the point of audacity. Washington was not yet a city. It was still farms, forests, and marshes. L'Enfant was drawing a future on ground that had not yet agreed to become it. By 1800, when the federal government moved to Washington from Philadelphia, the capital existed more in intention than in fact. The Capitol building was partially complete. Workers were still laying stone, and the central dome that would eventually define the skyline had not yet been attempted. Abigail Adams, arriving with her husband John to take up residence in the new executive mansion, wrote with barely concealed dismay about the state of things. The house was enormous and cold, without enough fireplaces to heat it properly. The grounds around it were bare. The city that was supposed to surround it had not yet materialized. And yet, there it was, a capital at the place where the Nacotchtank had once traded, where tobacco planters had built their docks, where Georgetown merchants had argued over prices, where Benjamin Banneker had read the stars. All that history compressed under the muddy foundations of something entirely new. Now I want to bring you into the present, to return to each of these places and show you what time has done. The banks of the Anacostia River, where the Nacotchtank people maintained their village for generations, are now lined with parks, bridges, and the infrastructure of a modern city. The village itself left no visible trace above ground. The river is still there, still following the same course it always has, but the world built along its shores has entirely replaced the one that preceded it. This is perhaps the most complete erasure in the district's long story. Georgetown's relationship to the waterfront has been complicated by time. The wharves that once defined it have largely disappeared, replaced by a waterfront park and recreational paths. The hill above still carries the dense brick texture of the 18th century town. Many of those original buildings still stand, still used, their facades unchanged, even as their interiors have been converted to restaurants, offices, and residences. Georgetown survived the centuries by absorbing new purposes while keeping its bones. Alexandria's old town is one of the most intact colonial streetscapes surviving anywhere on the East Coast. Walk down King Street today, and you are, in terms of scale and proportion, essentially walking the same street that John Carlyle and his neighbors knew. The buildings have been maintained and restored. The grid is unchanged. The waterfront is now given over to pleasure rather than commerce, but the relationship between street and river, the fundamental logic of the place, has held. The boundary stones that Ellicott and Banneker placed in 1791 to mark the corners of the federal district are still there. 40 of them originally set, most of them still standing. They sit in small iron-fenced enclosures in parks and wooded lots, largely unvisited, easy to walk past without noticing. Each one is a physical object placed by human hands more than 2 centuries ago, still occupying the exact spot where it was set down. There is something quietly remarkable about that continuity, a stone in the ground that connects the present moment directly to the surveyors who measured these fields when the Capitol existed only as a plan. And then there is L'Enfant's plan itself. Look at Washington, D.C. from the air, and you can still read it. The diagonal avenues cutting across the grid, the circles and squares at their intersections, the long axis from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, the geometry of intention laid down on land that was still largely empty when it was drawn. The city grew, changed, expanded far beyond the original 10-mile square, but the pattern L'Enfant imposed on its center has never been erased. It is the most enduring artifact of the founding, more durable than any individual building, still organizing the daily movement of hundreds of thousands of people who may never have thought about where that pattern came from. Washington, D.C. is often described as an artificial city, invented, planned, imposed on a landscape by deliberate political decision. And in one sense, that's true. The Capitol was placed here by a compromise negotiated in a dining room in New York and built according to a plan drawn by a French engineer on land that belonged to Maryland and Virginia farmers. But the land itself is not artificial. It carries everything that happened on it before the plan arrived. The Nacotchtank villages, the tobacco plantations, the merchant docks of Georgetown and Alexandria, the boundary stones of Ellicott and Banneker, the muddy foundations of a capital that had not yet become what it intended to be. All of it is still there, layered beneath the marble and the monuments, woven into the ground the city stands on. The Washington we know is the most recent version of a place that has been, in turn, a river valley, a trading ground, a colonial frontier, a tobacco economy, a planned capital, a city still deciding what it means to be. Each version overwrote some of what came before it and preserved, usually without intending to, traces of what it could not quite erase. That is what history feels like when you look closely enough. Not a sequence of clean chapters, but a landscape of overlapping marks, some bold, some almost invisible, all of them still present if you know where to look. Thank you for watching. If you have thoughts, questions, or suggestions for the next city, leave them in the comments. I'd love to know which place you'd want to move through next.